PFC. Eli Garza had been told two things about Staff Sergeant Nora Vass before he ever met her. The first was that she was good with sutures. The second was that she had a habit of showing up where she wasn't needed and staying longer than she was welcome. He'd gotten both pieces of information from the same man. Sergeant First Class Dobbs ran the supply desk at Fob Harlan's field hospital, and who had been wrong about most things Garza had observed in his first 3 weeks on post. Still, Garza had filed the information away. He was 20 years old, and on his first deployment, he had learned early that the right posture in a place like this was to watch and say nothing until the picture filled in on its own. The picture filled in on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the medevac set down 60 yards from the hospital tent with a 4-man ranger, Element, and one of them critical. Garza heard the rotors before he heard anything else. Then the stretcher was through the tent flap, and the tent was suddenly very loud. Boots on the plywood floor, the blood pressure called out in a flat voice, the monitor dragged into place, and powering up with its low preliminary tone. Garza pressed himself to the near wall and tried to make himself useful by staying out of the way. The man on the stretcher was young, maybe 25, with the kind of stillness that was not rest. Two of the rangers who had come in with him stayed at the threshold of the tent. They did not speak. They watched the way men watch something they can affect and cannot leave. Major Kern came through the back curtain already pulling on gloves. He was the senior trauma surgeon at Fob Harlan, a compact man with gray at his temples, and a manner that's just... He had been the most capable person in every room he'd entered for the last 20 years and had stopped bothering to check. He took in the stretcher, the monitor, the corpsman already running the IV line, and then he took in Staff Sergeant Vass, who was standing at the instrument tray with her hands already gloved. The chest kit was laid out in front of her. Decompression needle, the gauge set, secondary needle staged to the right. The sequence of it clear and prepared before Kern reached the patient. He looked at her the way a man looks at a chair someone has pulled up to a table he didn't set a place at. "Step back, Sergeant," he said, not unkindly in the tone of a man who considers the matter settled by his own arrival. "You're a medic, not a surgeon. I've got it from here." Vass looked at him once. She had dark, level eyes and a stillness about her that Garza could not quite name yet. Not calm exactly. Not the calm of someone who wasn't worried, but the calm of someone who had already made the necessary decisions and was simply waiting for the room catch up. She stepped back from the tray without a word. She did not step far. She stayed close enough that her gloved hands were still at tray height. And she turned her attention to the monitor in the way of someone who is reading something the rest of the room has not yet understood is written. Kern moved in, called for the chest kit, and began. Garza watched. He was supposed to be observing her suture technique. That was the assignment Dobbs had given him, half as a joke, the sort of joke that passes for mentorship in a forward-deployed field hospital. But what he found himself watching instead was her face, which was turned toward the monitor and toward Kern's hands, and toward the patient's chest all at once, in a way that suggested she was tracking all three simultaneously, and finding one of them more worrying than the others. Kern's first attempt at the decompression sequence met resistance. He adjusted, called for a different gauge, adjusted again. The monitor's tone shifted. Not into alarm territory, not yet, but Garza had been in this tent long enough now to know the difference between the tone that meant patience and the tone that meant the window was beginning to close. Kern called for the second needle. His jaw was set. His hands were sure but not easy, the sureness of a man working just at the edge of his range and knowing it. Vass did not move. She was watching his hands with the careful and neutral attention of someone grading a performance. The monitor changed its tone. "Pressure dropping," the line corpsman said, flat and even, the way they all learned to say the bad things. Kern reached for the instrument, and his movement had a quality in it, now that had not been there a minute earlier. Not panic. Kern was not a man who panicked, but something adjacent to it, the particular tension of a man applying a known approach to a problem that is no longer behaving according to the known rules. His second attempt opened the space, but not enough. The angle was off. The approach was not landing where it needed to land, and Garza could see from where he stood. 22 years old, 3 weeks deployed. no business having an opinion. That the man on the table was running out of time in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's intentions. Vass stepped forward. Sir. Her voice was quiet, not soft quiet. There is a difference, and Garza heard it. Bilateral approach. Left side first, third intercostal, mid-clavicular. The cavities shifted. I've done this before. Let me. Kern turned. His expression communicated several things, none of them generous. I said, step back, Sergeant. I have this under control. You don't, she said, just that. 2 words, no heat in them, no accusation. A statement of observable fact, the way you'd note the wind direction or the time of day. The monitor screamed. 1 full second, the tent held its breath. Then Kern stepped aside. Not because he chose to. Garza would think about this later. Because the monitor had made the choice for both of them. And Vass's hands were at the tray, and then at the patient, and her movements were not hurried and not slow. They were precise in the way that does not come from thinking about precision, but from having performed the same sequence so many times that the hands know the path without asking the mind for directions. She named the steps as she worked, not for Kern, not for the rangers at the threshold, but for Garza, standing closest, the one who needed them most. Left side, third intercostal, mid-clavicular, she said. And the needle went where she said it would go. And the sound that followed was the sound of a problem beginning to be solved. Side, same level, watch the drift. The second needle. Hold that gauge at 45 degrees. Don't let it move. 45, Garza said. Moving. The monitor changed its tone again. Back toward the sound that meant patience. Back toward the sound that meant time. Vass worked. Kern stood at the curtain and watched, and did not speak, and the tent was quiet, except for the monitor, and the careful sound of her doing the thing she had told him she could do. Then from outside the tent, a single crack of rifle fire. Close, 20 yards, maybe less. One of the rangers at the threshold turned. The second one's hand went to his sidearm and found nothing. They'd been stripped at the medevac. Protocol, because a field hospital is not a weapons area. And whoever had broken through the perimeter wire on the south side of Fob Harlan had timed it, or had been lucky, and it did not matter which. The tent flap opened. The man who came through it was not in any uniform Garza recognized. He had a sidearm raised, and he was moving fast, and he was not moving toward the rangers. He was moving toward the stretcher, toward the patient, toward the specific point in the room that mattered. With the deliberate intent of someone who had been sent to finish something that had been started elsewhere. Garza had time to process all of this in approximately 1 second, which was about 1 second longer than Vass needed. She was already turning when the flap opened. She crossed the distance between the instrument tray and the intruder in 5 steps, and the steps were level and unhurried, as if she were walking to the supply shelf for a roll of gauze. And then, she was not walking anymore, and the intruder's weapon arm was going the wrong direction, and the sidearm was in her hand, instead of his hand. Steens, the man was face down on the plywood floor, with his cheek pressed to the boards and his wrist at an angle that would require different kind of medical attention at a later time. The whole sequence had taken 4 seconds. Garza would count it back 3 times later and arrive at 4 seconds each time. She handed the sidearm grip first to the nearest ranger, without looking at him. She turned and walked back to the patient. Still holding 45? She said to Garza. Yes, Sergeant, good. Don't let it drift. Kern had not moved. He stood with his back to the curtain and his gloves still on, and an expression on his face that Garza had not seen on a man before and could not find a clean name for. Not embarrassment and not anger, something older than both of those. The look of a man who has just had to revise a very large and long-held idea about the shape of a room he thought he had completely mapped. Vass finished the decompression, sutured the entry points with the same unhurried economy she had used on everything else, and named each step in the same quiet voice. She did not look up at Kern. She did not look at the rangers or at the man on the plywood floor who was now zip-tied and being handled by a corpsman who had found his purpose in the last 6 minutes. She looked at the patient, at the gauge, at the monitor, and at Garza, who was holding steady at 45 degrees because she had told him to, and because it seemed to him, in this particular moment, that doing what she said was the most important thing he could do with himself. When she finished, she stripped her gloves. The patient's eyes opened. He was not entirely present, blood loss, medication, but he was conscious enough to know where he was, and he turned his head, and he looked past Kern, past the monitor, past the rangers who had crowded back into the threshold. He looked at Vass, he said, low and certain, the way a man says something he has known for a long time, Ironbell. The two rangers at the threshold straightened, not because anyone told them to. They simply straightened the way soldiers straighten when something they recognize comes into the room. One of them was quiet. The other pressed his fist once, briefly, against his sternum, which was not a regulation gesture, and was the most honest thing Garza had witnessed. Weeks on post, the tent flap opened a second time. Colonel Ardeen, the Phobe Harlan Trauma CO, was a tall woman who moved like someone who had already made every decision she needed to make before she walked through the door. She had a tablet in one hand and a combat medic badge in the other, pinned to her palm, not to the tablet, carried there from the command post with purpose. She stopped at the foot of the stretcher. She looked at the patient, and at the monitor, and at the man zip-tied on the floor, and at Kern, who was still standing at the curtain, and then she looked at Vass. "Sergeant Vass," she said. Vass looked up from the instrument tray she had begun breaking down. Dean turned the tablet so the screen faced the tent. The file on it was not long. Sealed records rarely are, the real ones, but it was dense, and Garza read enough of it from where he stood to understand that the picture he had been given about Nora Vass had been missing most of its details, deployment seals, a certification line he had to read twice. Youngest woman to hold Army Special Operations Combat Medic certification. Cheat. Below it, Unit Level IV Combatives Record unadjusted. Direct Action Support Operator, 2 theaters. Below that, the call sign, which he had just heard spoken by a ranger who had not needed to be reminded of it. "This belongs to you," Ardeen said. She crossed the tent and pinned the combat medic badge to Vass's collar herself. Not handed it to her, pinned it, the way you pinned something back that had no business being unpinned. Then she stepped back. "Call sign Ironbell," she said clearly, "tent and the air outside it and for the record." Confirmed active. The 4 rangers came to full attention without a word being directed at them. It happened the way the best things happen in the military. Not because it was ordered, but because it was right, and everyone present knew it at the same moment. Major Kern came to attention last, slowly, the way a man does a thing he has not done enough times for the motion to come naturally. He held it, he did not speak, and Garza decided, watching him hold that posture in silence, that this was more than he would have asked of him. Garza himself had not moved from beside the stretcher. His hand was still on the gauge, 45 degrees, steady, not drifting, and the patient's chest rose and fell with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had been brought back from the edge of something by a woman who had stood at worse edges than this one, and had always known, without making a show of knowing, exactly what to do next. Later that evening, when Dobbs asked him what Vass was like to work with, Garza thought about it. He thought about the needle and the angle and the monitor going quiet. He thought about 4 seconds of footsteps that did not rush. He thought about still holding 45. Asked in the same voice a person uses when the answer is what matters, and the question is just the kindest way to make sure. "Good with sutures," he said. Dobbs nodded like that confirmed everything. Garza did not correct him. Some pictures he had decided you leave to fill in on their own. The ones that matter always do.